But now for the reason we're all here, trying to make him nervous. He's usually so cool. Anyway, back when we had our 20th anniversary celebration, afterwards, I got with Nick and I'm like, he started telling me all these wonderful stories. I'm like, oh, those are great. We should have a museum club and you get to tell all those stories. And so I somehow conned him into breaching his retirement agreement and coming back to the museum. But a little bit about Nick for people who don't maybe know him. He spent 18 years teaching and coaching at Astronaut High School in Florida. 14 years sports administration for the Sunshine State Games, the Florida Games, Georgia Games, and the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia. 3 years wellness director, Financial Security Corporation of America in Orlando, Florida. And 19 years, he tried to retire 3 times. The third time was the charm, and it really stuck. But during that time, I think he played every role in the beginning, but officially program director and director of development. And he's been 3 years retired, and he's going to talk about the stories we haven't heard about that past 20 years. I think it'll be a good, an interesting presentation. And if you have any questions, he'll have some time at the end to answer those questions. So welcome, Nick Gailey.
All right, let's see how good I am at this. It seems like we got a rowdy crowd here, which is okay. Okay. Is that working? The microphone? Okay. Just let me know if it isn't. Yeah, it's nice to be here to share with you some things that maybe you don't know, maybe you don't want to know. But this will be a little bit different. And of course, I think the publicity on the net was something to do with T.Rex Named Sue. And undoubtedly, that story, the story of Sue, is probably the most, if not one of the most fascinating, spellbinding stories in the history of paleontology, in the history of the world. And we're going to get to that, about why it is, and the role that we played in making that story come true, at least for the Museum of Idaho. But to get there, we have to go down a little historical path of what brought us there. And some of you will know a lot of this. Some of you will hear that for the first time. But if you want to know where I'm getting my information, it's from people like Jim Bennett, Mae McEwen, Lois Nickham, Ladine Harmstrom, Shirley McBride, Ida Hardcastle, David Pennock, and there's many, many others. But most of these people were the original pioneers of the Bonneville County Historical Society. And I spent a lot of time with these people, nearly 20 years, and learned a lot from the storytelling. You can get a lot of it on the internet by Googling it, of course, but you're not going to get some of the things I'm going to share with you that they shared with me. So, as we all know, the story got started in 1914 when the city of Idaho Falls petitioned the Carnegie Foundation for a grant to build a library. They received that grant, and I think it was a matching grant. And the city built on this corner the Carnegie Library, started in 1914, opened in 1916. And Idaho Falls had a really nice library for a city that small at that time. And most of you know that back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Idaho Falls was a rough town. I mean, we won't go into the details, but it was a rough town. And to have a library like that, where, remember now, education was in the little schoolhouse. There wasn't any internet or TV or even radio to speak of. And so any place that you could get more education was hugely important. And so the library opened in 1916, and for the next 60 years, it hosted all the citizens, the residents, the youth of the greater Idaho Falls, Bonneville County area. So we're talking 3 generations, nearly 3 generations of people that have come to that building and enjoyed more education day after day, week after week. And it was really a very fond and appreciated building. And then in the 1970s, as you know, the city of Idaho Falls built a new library, which is still right down the street. And the building was then shuttered. And for the next 10 years or so, the city and other groups tried to find a reasonable use for the building. There were some clubs that used it temporarily, and that didn't work out too well. There was a homeless group that actually hosted the homeless people for a while, and that didn't work out. And so finally, the building, after it was shut down, came into ruin almost, with a lot of graffiti and vandalism going on. And so the city was debating what to do with it. Meanwhile, a group of ladies for a number of years had been given a little corner of the Bonneville County Courthouse. And in that corner, they placed historical documents. And that little organization was called Bonneville County Historical Society and had a few members. And so when they heard that the building was going to be demolished or something of that nature, they went to the mayor and asked the mayor if they could have the building for a museum. And the mayor said, well, I don't know, we'll see. Go to the city council, because they're the ones that are having all these plans about what to do with it. So the ladies went to the city council with their plan, and the city council listened, and then they voted unanimously to not give the building to the women, and told the mayor. So the ladies went to the mayor and said, you know, we really would like a chance at this. And he did change his mind. And he told the ladies they had 6 months to have the building. And in 6 months, if it isn't successful, then he will turn it back to the city council. And their plans were either to make it a parking lot or for the city, or to sell it commercially to a buyer. And so this group took over the building, and in 1985 opened the Bonneville County Historical Society. And this was an all volunteer group of people, not one paid person. And they put together this historical museum with their items, all donated, all volunteer. And then later, as most of you know, built the downstairs Eagle Rock, which even today, most people consider an incredible exhibition of historical items. And most of you know, I hope you know, that most of those items in that Eagle Rock exhibition are donated by people from Idaho Falls, and they're authentic items. And so that went on for a number of years with the Bonneville County Historic Society Museum. The mayor at that time, who gave the approval for that against the city council, was Tom Campbell. And you talk about going out on the limb, but that was successful. And then we come to 2000, and Lois Nickham, who is the director of the Bonneville County Historical Society, and her band of volunteers are moving along nicely. And a young man graduates from high school by the name of Greg Carr, goes to college, and then eventually ends up at Harvard. And most of you know, he and his roommate invented, I think, the world's first answering machine. in the late 80s, mid 80s, something like that. And very successful and sold it. And then Greg becomes chairman of the board of Prodigy, the world's first internet company. And at that time, when the internet companies were just beginning, most of the CEOs didn't get huge salaries like they do today, but they received huge amounts of stock. And I don't know if you know the history of Prodigy back then, but it exploded. And Greg Carr did so well with the stock market and the value of his stocks that he retired right around 40 years old. And he lived in Boston, and he would come home. And he would often come home and come over to the library, the Carnegie Library. And he'd been gone, and he was amazed at what this group of volunteers had done with the museum and Eagle Rock, and how it was a functioning educational institution. Oh, by the way, when Kim said about your questions, I don't want you to hold your questions. You have your questions, just ask me right as we get to them, as you think of them. So you don't have to wait till the end if you have any questions. I hope you do. Anyway, so Greg was interested in giving back, and he did. He was helping a number of individuals privately around Idaho Falls. He made contributions to the Colonial. He made a huge contribution to the Anne Frank Memorial in Boise. We had a radical person up in northwest Idaho who was shut down by the federal government, and his land was confiscated by the federal government and put up for auction, and Greg Carr bought the land and donated it to the College of North Idaho. So here's a young person who's made a great deal of money and is giving back to his home state and his home city. But he really wants to make a mark in Idaho Falls. So he has a boyhood friend who has gotten his PhD, and he's teaching at Hayes College in Kansas. His name is David Pennock. And David's parents are getting older now, living in Idaho Falls, and David wants to get back home. And of course, you know, he was very fond of Idaho Falls. And so he and Greg are talking one day, and Greg offers him a position to come back and find the perfect mark that Greg can make on the city of Idaho Falls. So David and his wife move back here and start looking around for the perfect thing that Greg Carr can do that will make a difference in the city of Idaho Falls. And that goes on for about a year. And and there's a lot of suggestions on what Greg Carr can do for the city or the area. So finally, Greg decides with David that he should make a donation to expand the museum and build a new museum. And there was a lot of support on the idea of building a new museum in some other place off the interstate. Or one popular idea was right off the Snake River. Sounds reasonable. So David and Greg had a lot of input from different people. And I have to tell you that it was Greg that decided that no, what the volunteers had done in this building, the Carnegie Building, for all those years was worth keeping. And he made that decision to invest the $3 million that he was donating into the museum, the Bonneville County Historical Society expansion. And he'd have to buy the Masonic Lodge, which was to the north, In fact, we're in that right now. This is the old Masonic Lodge. And expand the museum so it could do more good work like it had been doing for the last 20 years or so, or nearly 20 years. No questions. Okay. Okay. You're not going to get an opportunity all the time. All right. So that's late 2001, early 2002. And I'm not around. I mean, I'm living outside of Blackfoot. We moved out here from Atlanta in 2000 without a job. And I'm looking for a job. And after a year and a half, can't find one. Nobody would hire me. And so finally, I see this ad in the paper, the Post Register. That's when it was being circulated every day. And it said, major project coming to Idaho Falls. Must have major project experience. Send resume to post office box. It didn't tell you anything of where it was or who it was or anything. So I put my resume in the mail on one day, and then the next day, I think I put it in on Wednesday, and Thursday afternoon, I get a call. And the person says, well, this is David Pennock. We got your resume, and it seems like we should interview you. And I said, oh, okay, thank you. And I said, when? And he said, well, how about tomorrow? And I go, okay, where am I going? And who am I talking to? I mean, I know your name's David Pennock, but I don't know what it is. And he says, oh, it's Bonneville County Historical Society, and just come up 91 and you'll see the building under construction. We've just started an expansion. I go, oh, okay. So I drive up and see David in the museum, and we're supposed to have a 30-minute interview, and it goes for 2 hours. And he was absolutely fabulous. He was likable, enthusiastic, smart. And of course, mentioned about this donor who was wanting to expand the museum. And it was intriguing. It was interesting. And after 4 interviews after that one, 5 interviews total, I got hired. But not before I also interviewed with Lois Nickham, who was the volunteer director. So we had David Pennock, the executive director, and then we had Lois Nickham, the volunteer director. And when Lois interviewed me, it was very short. I don't know how many of you know Lois Nickham, but she was right to the point. It didn't matter what it was. And she was a no fool around, get it done director. And that's why the Historical Society and the band of volunteers that she had were so successful. Lois was the leader. So Lois said, well, I saw your resume. We've chit-chatted for a little bit. And she said, I've decided that I think you're the one. And I go, oh, okay. And she stands up from her desk and leans over and picks up a stack of files this high. And she reaches them up there and she says, yeah, I want you to get hired because somebody has to handle this mess. And I said, well, what is this mess? And she said, what we're going to do when this expansion gets done. And I said, oh, okay. So I go down to see David, and then, of course, came back for 2 or 3 more interviews and finally got hired. So now it's early 2002. And the big thing is, what are we going to do? The museum is under construction, supposed to be completed in the next 8 to 10 months. And what are we going to do that's really, really big? That's all we knew. It had to be big. And the pressure was there. Not because of Greg, just because if somebody goes out and spends $3 million, donates $3 million, and the city has expectations. And here's where we start entering the really interesting part of T.Rex Named Sue. So I go through the files, and it's rather clear to me that of all the research that had been done for the last 6 months by both the Carr Foundation in Boston and the lone employee that David had hired at the museum, the lone paid employee had done research, and they had compiled everything together. T.Rex Named Sue from the Field Museum was absolutely the just beyond any shadow of a doubt, if we could get. Now, I want you to realize where we are. We have the executive director who has a PhD and was teaching at Arkansas University and then transferred over and was teaching at Hayes College and has always been in the academic world, David Penrose. Absolutely no experience in the museum or business experience. And then we have an academic teacher who also coached, did a little wellness work and sports administration. And the only time I've been in a museum was to see the exhibits. And even that wasn't a lot. And then we have one paid employee who is 21 years old and was hired from one of the hotels that used to book rooms. And that's it. So we talk to the Field Museum. We send them the plans of the finished product and what we want to do. And believe it or not, we get this letter that we've been approved for T.Rex Named Sue. We will be the 13th place in the world to host this exhibition. Now, a little insight on why we got that. We were considered by the Field Museum as a nonprofit organization. It's not a for-profit organization. They're huge in education and reaching the underserved. Idaho Falls, East Idaho was considered hugely an underserved cultural educational area of the United States. So almost by charter, they're required to do something like that. And the only other place in the world that had ever been like that was Hayes, Kansas, believe it or not. So we, of course, get that acceptance letter and say, okay, just what's the next step? And they say, we send the contract. So sure enough, a week later, we get this contract with this letter. Here's the enclosed contract. Have your lawyers go over it. Make any changes necessary. Include a cashier's check for $25,000. And I'm in David's office and saying, we got any lawyers? Well, we did. We had a Steve Carr lawyer who was a real estate lawyer. He was on our board and he was overseeing the construction, the expansion construction, because Greg was in Boston and Steve had the responsibility to keep that construction on schedule. So besides not knowing that we had any lawyers, I said, we don't have any money, do we? And we didn't. We didn't. We had no money. I know you can't believe this, but we didn't. So how are we going to get $25,000 to send this contract back within, a week or so? Well, the CHC Foundation, which most of you are familiar with, had granted the Bonneville County Historical Society a $300,000 facilities grant. And the CHC has very strong guidelines written into their constitution or whatever you call it, that their monies must be used for tables and chairs and benches and microphones. It cannot be used for salaries or exhibit costs or anything like that. In fact, it's so stringent that they require you to go out and buy the chairs, pay for it, get the receipt, send it to them, and they reimburse it. That's the protocol. Well, we had a little insider. His name was Chuck Rice. Chuck used to run INL before it was INL. And he was on our board. And Chuck was also chairman of the board of the CHC Foundation. And Chuck had enormous persuasive qualities. So we asked Chuck, or I should say David asked Chuck, if there could be an exception. And Chuck went to his board, people, I think individually, privately. And when they met, they approved a $25,000 loan from the grant that we would pay back. We got the check, signed the contract, sent it to the Field Museum, and we were locked in for an opening on February 18th of 2003, with the grand opening of the VIP event on the 17th. So that's how we got to that point. But let's get to the story of the most fantastic discovery ever and why Sue was so perfect. And I hope that you will agree that when I share this with you, why she was so magnificent. It had all the elements of intrigue and interest, worldwide interest, because we have to go to South Dakota, the Black Hills Institute of Geological Research. Peter Larson, the executive director, the owner of these. And every year, the Blackfoot Institute would have intern paleontologists come to the Black Hills. They would put them up, they would feed them, and these intern paleontologists would go out to the Black Hills and look for fossils. Okay. And whatever they found, the Black Hills Institute would have or keep most of it. And at this time, paleontology was changing for the first time, maybe ever. Because in the past, when somebody found a fossil, it was almost a sacred thing, used for education, universities, exhibitions. But at this time, things were beginning to change and people were starting to sell fossils. Oh my goodness. That was new. Okay. So a group shows up and five guys and one gal. And they're out there in the Black Hills looking for fossils. And they're not doing too well. They have a van. And after about 2 or 3 days, they're on the way back again, not doing too well. And the van gets a flat tire. And they all pile out of the van. And the guys go get the spare out and the jack, and they're jacking it up. And the gal's name is Sue Henderson. And she's standing around and saying, hey, well, look, there's nothing for me to do. This road goes that way about 4 or 5 miles, and there's this creek going this way. I'm going to walk down this creek, and it bisects the road about 2 miles up. You pick me up there. And they said, okay. So Sue Henderson walks down this creek bed, and there's a cliff overhanging it. And she walks along, she sees a bone on the ground, and it's rather large. And she looks up into the side of the hill, and there's this shoulder sticking out. And she knows enough that this is big, and it's a theropod of some kind, doesn't know what kind, but this needs to be looked at. So she walks out the road, the guys pick her up, they go to the Black Hills Institute, see Peter Larson and say, listen, we found something out here. You need to come out and look at it. They get in their truck, they go out and look at it. Sure enough, it's big, really big, and it's in good shape. And there might be more there. So Peter contacts the landowner, and I think his name was Henderson, Sioux, Native American. And he has deed to this land that this fossil was found on. So Peter and he are negotiating on what to pay for these bones. And they come up with a $5,000 cost. At that time, it's 1990. At that time, that was the largest amount of money ever paid for a fossil, ever. Unknown fossil. You know what it was? So the check's made out to Henderson for $5,000. You know, in the check down there where it says for, Peter Larson put the word therapy, 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 which means dinosaur. Doesn't tell you what kind of dinosaur, but it makes sense. So he has the check. He goes to the bank. Peter gets his pack hose out, and very carefully they dig up that whole side, and very carefully put the dig areas that they wrapped on a low boy and take it back to the Black Hills Institute. And they begin to clean off the dirt and all the other debris. And they start discovering that they have come upon a dinosaur that is 90 to 95% complete. The skull is the largest ever. And they have a real treasure. And this goes worldwide. This goes everywhere. NASA gets into it because the skull was so intact. NASA thought they could penetrate the skull without destroying it and see what organs or brain tissue or whatever else was still intact. And then it really went worldwide. So all of a sudden, the Native American says, wait a minute, you owe me more money. Meanwhile, the Sioux tribe now chimes in and says, no, that's our fossil. You had the land, but we gave you that land in trust. So we're the owners of the fossil. Peter Larson of the Black Hills Institute says, I own the fossil. Here's the copy of the check. You cashed it. That goes on for months. And then the fourth party gets into it, the federal government. The federal government tells Peter Larson, give the fossil to Henderson and they'll work it out with the tribe. Peter says no. And that goes on for a while. This is all big international news all over the world because this is the biggest dinosaur ever found, the most complete dinosaur ever found in the history of the world. Okay. So one morning at 7:30 a.m. or so, the FBI and the National Guard of South Dakota raid the Black Hills Institute with guns. People had to put their hands up, had to come out. They brought low boys to confiscate Sue, and they charged Peter Larson and his staff with 58 felonies for not complying and for other reasons. So this goes worldwide. And then over the next several years, there's a trial. And to cut to it real quick, in the end, the landowner got the fossil. And we won't go into details why, but that's another story. It's too long. And again, he eventually, most of you know, sold it at auction in New York for $8.4 million. Or was it 8.5? It's up there. Okay. So the Field Museum had donors, McDonald's and a couple others that put up the money. And the Field Museum was given the original Sue, and they made 2 replicas. And in 2001, they started circulating these T-Rexes all over the world. And then we were scheduled for February of 2003. So what I'm telling you is the seeds of this incredible find and this controversy is what made Sue a story that was on everybody's mind. Everybody. Because when I was in Georgia, not even knowing about that I was going to be out here, I read about Sue. It was on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution several times. So the impact worldwide, nationwide, not to mention within the paleontology communities or other educational communities, was enormous. So we get Sue and we're planning. Now remember, we still have myself, I was a paid employee. David was being paid by the Carr Foundation at that time. And we have that young lady who's being paid. And everybody else is a volunteer. I know that's kind of hard for you to believe, but it's the truth. This man was a volunteer back then. So it was remarkable, the benefits of ignorance. Because if I didn't know what I didn't know, and David didn't either, and that helped us. And the saving grace was our intent. But more important than that was the wonderful people in this town. The same core type of people that built the Bonneville County Historical Society back in the mid-'80s through the 2000s were those people who came to us to help us at this time. And we needed help because we are now going to host the greatest dinosaur in the history of the world. And nobody at this time had done anything like that in this area. So we're getting organized from volunteer committees, and Sue is going to arrive, and we decide that one of the best things we can do is have an entrance. And west of the interstate, there was a big parking lot. It was some type of store, that Kmart, that had closed. This is back in 2002, 2003. And so I had been working with the other sites in the United States that had Sue and asking them all the things they did and all the things they should have done, or if they had to do it again, what did they do? And I was getting great information. So we decided to meet Sue and the 3 semis out of town. And we would decor the Mayflower orange vans with signage and maybe a dinosaur tail sticking out the end. And we coordinated with the police, Idaho Falls Police and the Sheriff's Department, that this was really going to be big and we couldn't have any traffic because these 3 Mayflower vans, the biggest they have, need to stay together. And so we meet out there, we do our decor. And of course, we advised the media, because media was very important, that this was going to take place. So they come in from the interstate, we meet there, and they start coming right down Broadway. And we have planes and helicopters flying over, live TV, all kinds of newspapers. They were showing it in the elementary schools. And there was some concern because during that time, we were having some threats of terrorist attacks. And at first, some of the teachers thought we were having a terrorist attack. And so it was a little iffy there for a while, but soon everybody saw the tail and understood it was T-Rex Sue coming in. And we had a great opening. I mean, a great delivery. And things like that really, really just spelled a lot of energy. And so we get Sue. Now remember, it's a lot different than it is now, meaning the logistics, the building. And so we had a parking lot. We had no downstairs basement. And so whatever was unloaded had to go to a warehouse. And so that was another step. And just getting the warehouse was a trick because we had no warehouse when we sent the contract in. David Pennock's father owned a factory that produced grains, and some of the grains were ground. And he said, well, you use our warehouse. Then we started thinking about it, and all that dust from that grinding of the warehouse items would fill those crates, and the Field Museum would cause us a lot of problems. But we had a donor come by because Jim Bennett, one of our board members, told him we needed the warehouse, and he had the warehouse just north of here that Rod is still using. And he loaned it to us, and then later that year, he donated it to us. And we still use it today. That's what I'm talking about, how the people came through. So things are moving towards the opening, and everybody is, to say excited, an understatement. But we're going to have a big media day. And of course, Sue is going to be displayed in the car atrium right out here. And so we bring a couple of the crates back and bring them in through this room right here, because this was the end of the museum, okay, back in the Dark Ages. And that floor in there was very scary because there's a basement out here. And it's a very deep basement, like a dungeon. And we're really worried about that. And we have one forklift that was donated by David's dad, an electric forklift. You're still using that? That thing's worth its weight in gold. Anyway, we're worried about that floor, so we put down another set of boards. So the media's out here. This is the room we're coming into to bring Sue out through her crate and then open the crate and pull her out. And then we're going to place her on the neck that's already, her other body's already been set up. So the media is really liking it. So we come through this door very safely. The boards worked. This room was carpeted. So we're going to that door right there. And we're coming through this door with the forklift carrying this huge crate. And just as the forklift comes in and pivots, the floor breaks. And the forklift wheel falls into between the beams. Oh my gosh, media's out there. We're in here. What are we going to do? Again, we had a group of INL volunteers, engineers. And it's like they wanted the challenge. So they maneuvered boards and leveraged boards, and not quickly, but we eventually lifted that up when we took the crate off, lifted it up, the forklift, and started progressing to the door. We got to the door, the crate was too big. See, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with amateurs. And you would think all these things would have been done, and we sent them the architectural information about the building and everything, and it was very tight. So we had to bring it back, take her out of the crate, her head. Now her head is enormous, and it's enormously heavy. So we bring her back in, put it, okay, forklift is lifting her very carefully. We go through the door. Everybody's oohing and awing. And now comes the moment where her neck is like this, and the forklift has to lift this thing up to connect it to the neck. Fortunately, the technicians from the field museum were there. We had, I think, 3 or 4 technicians, and they were all in place with ladders and everything like that. And our forklift couldn't lift it that high. This is all true. So somebody says to me, Nick, Bennett Glass Supply has a lift type of mechanism. Why don't you go ask them? So I walk out this door, walk across the parking lot, go in and see Dan. And Dan loved the Bonneville County Historical Society. I didn't know that. And he loved what we had done. And he said, sure, we'll help you. So he comes out, they bring their machine over here, through the doors, through this door, over there, and they pick up that head. This machine apparently is good for picking up glass and other heavy things up high. And they put that head on Sue, and the media absolutely goes crazy. We go crazy too. But anyway, that was the situation about how ignorant you can be and how lucky you can be with the right people wanting to be there for you, because in every situation, that's how it was for us. It's like the people that made the original museum and the energy and the dedication that they had. We had a new group in here, and many of them were from INL, and they just did an incredible job for us. So we open with a VIP party on the 17th. We have 680 people. The fire marshal was here. It was kind of uncomfortable, but we were able to open with Sue. Sue ran for 3.5 months. We were open 80 hours a week, 7 days, 9 to 9. On Sunday, it was 10 to 8. Our work week between Lois, the museum volunteer director, David, the executive director, and me, we split it. So we just said, okay, everybody's going to work 30 plus hours, and that way we can handle it. Nobody asked for. Okay. We're seeing 1,000 people a day. On Saturdays, it's 3,000 to 3,500. It is absolutely crazy. We have all the little things up at the entrance, and what do they call those things you put out there? Stanchions. They're through the stanchions, through the door, across the road, down the parking lot that wasn't there at that time. In line. And the pressure is incredible. Everybody taking money is a volunteer. That's what you're running. And at that time, people were still using cash. That's how dark the ages were. So we had a problem that since we're open till 9, getting that cash out of this building. And whoever worked the late shift was responsible for taking it to the bank about 10 o'clock. And that's kind of risky, carrying around, $10, $15, $20,000 cash. So we're rolling, and our director of volunteers isn't doing well, and he resigns. And Ida Hardcastle we had director of volunteers and 6 assistant volunteer coordinators. And the assistant volunteer coordinators scheduled the volunteers for 4-hour shifts. And by the way, we had 400 people that volunteered for T.Rex Sue. You were one of them. And I get Ida Hardcastle and some other AVCs together, and I say, well, what are we going to do? And Ida says, Nick, calm down. She said, we were basically handling it anyway. We'll handle it. And by golly, they did. A week later, Lois Nickham resigns. And Lois had been the volunteer director since 1985. So 18 years. And that was a huge blow. It just come to the end, volunteering. She'd been a volunteer, the most incredible volunteer you'd ever see. Lois's trip to the National Museum Convention, whether it was in New York or Kansas City, Lois paid her own way. There was no reimbursement. She never asked for any. And when she resigned, then it fell back on David and myself to be here the whole time. And we maintained that with the help of our staff. We now had hired another person for me. So we had 4 paid employees, counting David. We ended up having 118,600. I think the new number is 119,000. Is that what you guys have come up with now? Yeah. We led the world per capita population against Kansas City, Seattle, all places on having people. Us and Hayes, the city of Hayes, who also hosted Sue and did very well also. So this is how we got started. The ticket revenue, and these are round figures, and this is gross, was over $500,000. The in-store museum store revenue from selling dinosaurs, all things like that, was nearly $300,000. So we put over $700,000 in the bank in 3.5 months. That's how we got started. Sue cost us, counting shipping, $115,000. And we had other exhibits. Sue only took up 3,500 feet. We had to fill 8,000 feet. And we had exhibits from several other institutions, all of it pro bono. The only thing we paid for was Sue. And so the story of Sue for us and where we were as an institution is remarkable. And it matches almost the beauty and the essence of the story of Sue. And it's been a wonderful ride from Sue on. And what has happened to this museum through its growth and another expansion is that you've become the cornerstone of Bonneville County and, quite frankly, Eastern Idaho, and maybe even the state of Idaho for cultural and educational activities. Because the standard that was set has been maintained and in many ways excelled. Our educational programs are off the wall. And the support this city and county and state has for this institution is beyond belief. And it has been my pleasure to be part of this over these years and make a small contribution to its success, hopefully, and hopefully to stay around and see further successes. So thank you for listening. That's the story of Sue. I hope you learned 1 or 2 things, or maybe, and have 1 or 2 questions. No, the real Sue is only in the Field Museum. All others are replicas. Yep. Yes. Yep. Well, we did. Well, the comment is about the school children, and you're absolutely right. We actually had, right, we had 36,000 school kids in 3.5 months. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. You would had to have been here to feel the energy and, from our standpoint, the pressure of the constant enthusiasm to see this exhibit. And people to come in and they'd stand in front of that dinosaur and be spellbound for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And it was all because, and while I spent some time about telling you the buildup to Sue, that 10 years of discovery, controversy with the Native Americans and the private business owner had all those elements. And we had another exhibit later on that had some of those elements called bodies. Remember? Bodies had some of that. A controversy that followed internationally, and bodies had 117,000, if I remember right. I'm probably going by the, yep. But close, but close. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know. I would have to say that Idaho Falls, let's say it this way, culture and education in Idaho Falls was not one of the higher end. Now, a rodeo or maybe a bonfire or baseball or ice hockey, they might have looked at it differently. But a museum, huh? So anyway, by the way, when we were doing all the things we were doing here in the early part, I will tell you that because I was out in the community a lot, we were running 3-1 or maybe 4-1 against us being successful back in 2002, because people didn't think we knew what we were doing, and you know now we didn't. Okay, but it was well, why are you doing this? You know, you can do other things. You know, build a water park or a baseball diamond. Anyway, yes. Yes. Yeah. And there's some pictures right up here of T.Rex Sue with the governor and David and Lois and a lot of important people. Yeah. Yeah. And the museum brought back Sue later on with, yeah, which was very smart and brought in 65,000, 70, something like that. Yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you for coming. Have a great weekend and keep it going.